UFC 329, McGregor vs. Holloway 2, is scheduled for July 11, 2026, at T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. Conor McGregor is walking back into that octagon after 5 years away, and the number on his check is something the sport has never quite had to negotiate before. A welterweight bout between former UFC featherweight and lightweight champion Conor McGregor and fellow former featherweight champion Max Holloway is scheduled to headline the event. McGregor's first appearance since he broke his leg at UFC 264 in July 2021. 5 years. That is how long the octagon has been without its biggest draw. And when the fight was announced, the conversation did not start with competitive matchmaking or weight class implications. It started as it always does with McGregor, with money. Conor McGregor is ecstatic about his upcoming payday for the Max Holloway rematch in his return to the octagon at UFC 329, expressing satisfaction with his paycheck and stating the organization honored him. Those words, "honored me," finally carry a weight that only makes sense when you understand what was happening behind the scenes, because the truth is, getting McGregor back in that cage was not just a sports negotiation. It was a financial reconstruction unlike anything the UFC had ever attempted. Here is the core of what is being reported. Dana White has addressed one of the more pressing financial questions surrounding McGregor's long-awaited return, explaining that the UFC has developed a formula to compensate big-name fighters who previously earned pay-per-view points under the old model. That formula, which we will break down in full, is the mechanism through which McGregor's payday for UFC 329 gets built. And if the reports circulating from credible MMA insiders are accurate, the guaranteed base alone is expected to exceed $15 million, with total earnings potentially climbing into the $20 to $30 million range. When you factor in performance bonuses, engagement incentives, and back-end elements under the new streaming deal. To put that in context, consider where this fight sits historically. They previously fought in August 2013 at UFC Fight Night, Shogun vs. Sonnen, in a featherweight bout early in their UFC careers, where McGregor won via unanimous decision. That fight paid McGregor somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of dollars, the kind of money that would have felt life-changing to him back then. The rematch, 13 years later, will pay him somewhere in the range of 8 figures. That arc, from a handful of thousands to potentially 8 figures, is the McGregor story in its purest financial form. Behind the scenes, the UFC coming to a deal with McGregor was not as easy as it sounds. Ariel Helwani described it as a massive, massive deal for the UFC and for Paramount to get him back in the mix. Helwani reiterated that the fight versus Holloway would be McGregor's first of 2 remaining on his current UFC contract. One more fight after this one, and then Conor McGregor potentially walks into free agency. That context matters enormously when you think about why the UFC moved heaven and earth to structure a deal that satisfied him, because the alternative, losing him entirely, was a commercial proposition they could not afford to entertain. Conor McGregor dominates the list of the most purchased UFC pay-per-view events, showcasing his immense popularity and drawing power. And in a new streaming era, one where the traditional mechanism that translated that drawing power into dollars no longer exists, the question of how you compensate a man like McGregor fairly became one of the most consequential financial questions in combat sports history. The Dublin native has earned over $41 million in his career in disclosed income per topology. However, the actual number could be much higher, considering most UFC fighters don't disclose their entire earnings. Disclosed figures in the UFC have always been the tip of the iceberg. The real money, PPV points, back-end bonuses, undisclosed locker room payments, has always lived below the surface. And for McGregor specifically, the gap between what was disclosed and what was actually earned has historically been enormous. The Khabib fight, disclosed at roughly $2 million purse, almost certainly generated far more when PPV points are accounted for. The Poirier trilogy, the Cerrone fight, each one a monster commercial event, each one paying McGregor figures that the commission records barely begin to capture. The Khabib fight, the Cerrone fight, and the two Poirier fights all headlined massive PPVs. And then stack the Mayweather boxing spectacle, which paid him well over $100 million. That is the financial legacy that sits behind this negotiation. That is the benchmark against which a $15 million guaranteed base needs to be understood. And that is why, even before a single punch is thrown at UFC 329, the story of Conor McGregor's return is already one of the most financially significant events in the history of the sport. To understand why McGregor's UFC 329 payday required an entirely new financial structure, you have to go back to the moment the old one collapsed. The UFC launched its new $7.7 billion broadcast deal with Paramount in January 2026, effectively eliminating the traditional pay-per-view purchase requirement for numbered events. Those cards are now included with a Paramount subscription, fundamentally changing how fighters who previously earned a percentage of pay-per-view revenue are compensated. For most fighters on the UFC roster, this shift was an inconvenience, a renegotiation point, an awkward contract clause to revisit. For Conor McGregor, it was something closer to a detonation. His entire deal, the architecture of his earning potential, had been built around one thing: PPV points. Take away pay-per-view, and you do not just change his contract. You effectively dismantle the engine that generated the most extraordinary fighter earnings in UFC history. McGregor said it plainly. Conor McGregor declared that his UFC contract was essentially void because there was no more pay-per-view, whereas his contract was based on pay-per-view sales. His exact words: "My contract essentially is void right now because there's no more pay-per-view, whereas my contract was based on pay-per-view sales." That statement, made publicly deliberately, was not an off-the-cuff frustration. It was a negotiating grenade lobbed directly into Dana White's lap. McGregor was not just flagging a contractual technicality. He was establishing, loudly and on the record, that he considered himself essentially a free agent until a new structure was agreed upon. And when McGregor makes that kind of declaration, the UFC does not have the luxury of calling his bluff. Because the alternative, a world where Conor McGregor fights his next major bout for a platform other than UFC, is commercially catastrophic. With Conor expected to return in the summer, he required a new style of deal to make up for the missing numbers from his sales, and Dana White explained just how that would work as they moved towards an announcement. The pressure on the UFC was enormous, and it came from multiple directions simultaneously. First, there was the sheer commercial weight of McGregor's drawing power, a fighter so dominant in PPV history that no other name comes close. He holds all 5 of the top slots for units sold in UFC history. 5 fights, 5 records. No one else in the history of the promotion has occupied even one of those positions. That kind of legacy does not walk into a negotiation quietly. Then there was the broader fighter community watching. Justin Gaethje, one of the sports elite, made his own position clear. When asked whether the Paramount deal was already benefiting fighters financially, Gaethje disputed the notion that the deal was already financially benefiting the fighters. "I hear Daniel Cormier saying that everybody is going to get paid more on this card." Gaethje said, "I'm not getting $1 more than I would have if this deal didn't happen." That public comment from a top 5 lightweight set a tone. If fighters of Gaethje's caliber were openly stating they saw no benefit from a $7.7 billion deal, then the UFC faced a significant credibility problem. And when McGregor, the man whose PPV records built the very value that Paramount paid $7.7 billion to acquire, makes his own declaration of contract nullity, the math becomes very simple. Compensate him fairly, or watch the entire new era launch without its biggest star. UFC co-founder and Combat Global CEO Campbell McLaren was blunt in his assessment. The deal is good for everyone except the fighters. He believes the promotion will have even more leverage over top fighters and their agents during negotiations without the PPV sales pressure. McLaren's framing reveals the fundamental tension at the heart of these negotiations. When there is no PPV, there is no external, verifiable metric for how much a fighter is worth on a given night. In the old world, If McGregor sold 2 million buys, his PPV points clause converted directly into a calculable number. X points per buy multiplied by Y price equals Z dollars. There was no room to argue. The math was the math. In the streaming world, that mathematical certainty evaporates. The UFC tells you what you are worth, and unless you have extraordinary leverage or you're willing to walk, you accept what you're given. McGregor had the leverage, and he showed he was willing to walk. The result was the formula that Dana White would eventually describe publicly, a mechanism designed specifically to replicate the earning potential of the PPV era, inside a streaming model calibrated to McGregor's historical drawing power. Former UFC Executive Vice President Marshall Zelaznik was optimistic that top fighters would receive comparable pre-deal payouts, pointing out that Paramount was only for U.S. rights. Zelaznik believed the new model could call for a creative compensation formula based on viewership and historical averages, with more potential guaranteed money. The key phrase there is historical averages. That is where the formula begins to take shape, and that is what part 3 of this story is about. Dana White has spent 30 years mastering the art of the deal in combat sports. He has negotiated with legends, managed superstars, and structured contracts that made some fighters extraordinarily wealthy and left others feeling shortchanged. But the McGregor negotiation inside a brand new broadcast era with the biggest draw in the sport's history, and a contract the fighter himself had declared void, was something White had never navigated before. His solution was elegant in its concept, if deliberately vague in its details. He called it a formula, asked about the economics. White replied, "There's a formula to it, and McGregor is going to do just fine. It's based on taking the average of his pay-per-view buys, and what they do is find an equation for that. We've done it for a lot more guys than just McGregor." Let that land for a moment. The UFC is averaging Conor McGregor's historical PPV numbers across all 5 of his record-holding events, and using that average as a basis for calculating what he should earn in the streaming era. It is, in essence, the UFC saying, "We know exactly what you were worth to us every time you fought. We are going to honor that value, even though the mechanism that generated it no longer exists." To understand what that average looks like, you need to know the numbers it is built from. The most watched UFC fight ever was at UFC 229, which earned 24 million PPV buys. That was McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, a fight fueled by one of the most combustible rivalries in combat sports history. A cultural clash that transcended MMA entirely and became a global event. His second fight with Nate Diaz did over 16 million buys, and the pay-per-view split on that alone would put him into 8-figure territory. UFC 264, McGregor's last fight, generated 100 PBV buys, followed by UFC 202 and UFC 257, with 1650 and 1600 buys respectively. Now run the math. Average those numbers, including the 24 million Khabib record, and you are looking at a consistent baseline of somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million buys per McGregor fight. At the PPV price points that were in effect during his run, that translated to hundreds of millions of dollars in gross revenue per event. McGregor's cut through PPV points was a fraction of that total, but a fraction of a very large number is still a very large number. The formula then takes that average, applies it to the equivalent streaming value, factoring in subscription uplift, viewership milestones, new subscriber acquisitions attributable to the event, and arrives at a guaranteed sum that approximates what the old PPV structure would have delivered. 2026 contracts feature engagement bonuses and higher guaranteed flat fees. Champions are now regularly seeing guaranteed purses in the $2 to $4 million range, regardless of the event's specific performance. Discretionary bonuses are now tied to streaming milestones, minutes watched, new subscriber signups attributed to the event, and social media engagement during fight week. That is the standard framework for a champion. McGregor is not operating in the standard framework. McGregor, who was among the sport's biggest pay-per-view draws, stood to be among the most affected by the transition to streaming, which also means his formula-derived number sits in a completely different tier to what even the current champions receive. As the biggest pay-per-view star in UFC history, White would have to pony up a whole lot of money that wasn't made available for other promotional stars like Jon Jones and Ronda Rousey in the Paramount era. That sentence is worth pausing on. Jon Jones, arguably the greatest fighter in UFC history by any competitive metric. Ronda Rousey, the woman who arguably did more to grow women's MMA into a global phenomenon than any single person. Neither of them, apparently, received the kind of formula-driven, history-honoring deal structure that McGregor secured. That is not a statement about their negotiating power. It is a statement about McGregor's commercial irreplaceability. UFC CEO Dana White touts the new 7-year, $7.7 billion rights deal with Paramount as a knockout for the promotion's fighters. They are now set to be exposed to a wider audience of consumers, thanks to Paramount's platform, a 77 million global subscriber base, which will be more accessible for fans who were previously paying as much as $80 an event for PPV on ESPN. The UFC's public framing is that the streaming deal expands the audience, and therefore expands the commercial opportunity for everyone. And that framing is not entirely wrong. Broader access genuinely does grow the sport's footprint. But for a fighter whose earnings were directly tied to how many people paid $80 per event to watch him fight, broader access at $8.99 a month is a very different proposition, unless the formula compensates for the difference. McGregor's statement, "They honored me," finally, suggests the formula did compensate. The finally is the operative word. It hints at a negotiation that was harder, longer, and more contentious than the clean announcement made it appear. To fully grasp what UFC 329 represents financially, you need the full weight of what came before it, because the number McGregor is expected to earn at UFC 329 does not exist in isolation. It exists in conversation with the most extraordinary earning history in combat sports. The August 2017 fight between Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor generated 43 million domestic pay-per-view buys and more than $600 million in revenue, ranking it second behind Mayweather's 2015 win over Manny Pacquiao. $600 million in total revenue for one night. McGregor's share of that, reports put it at over $100 million, when purse, PPV points, and sponsorship are combined. Remains the single largest payday in the history of a fighter who came from a working-class Dublin background and was collecting welfare payments in the years before his UFC career took off. His record-breaking boxing clash with Floyd Mayweather saw McGregor take home an eye-watering $72 million in purse and sponsorship alone. From that peak, $100 million plus for a single fight, the trajectory of McGregor's UFC earnings becomes the story of a man trying to replicate the unreplicable inside a different commercial framework. The antitrust records show him pulling multi-million-dollar paydays for fights like Chad Mendes, Nate Diaz, and Eddie Alvarez, with single-night totals pushing well above $5 million even before PPV bonuses. Those pre-Mayweather figures, before anyone fully understood how big the McGregor commercial engine was, look modest in retrospect, but they established the foundation. Then came the Khabib fight, UFC 229. Nurmagomedov versus McGregor generated 2,400 PBV buys and $180 million in revenue. McGregor's disclosed purse for that night, per commission records, was approximately $3 million, but disclosed purses in the UFC, especially for McGregor, have always been the most incomplete picture imaginable. His PPV points alone on a 2.4 million buy card would have generated multiples of that disclosed figure. While specific locker room bonuses are undisclosed, Conor McGregor holds the records for highest disclosed payouts and estimated earnings, with fights against Khabib Nurmagomedov and Dustin Poirier netting him significantly over $20 million when factoring in PPV points and side deals. And then there is the question of his last actual UFC fight, the 2021 trilogy bout against Poirier, which ended with the broken leg that began the 5-year absence. UFC 264. That final McGregor appearance generated 18 million PPV buys, making it the single biggest non-Khabib UFC PPV in history at that point. The disclosed purse was in the millions. The actual total, factoring in points on 18 million buys at $80 per buy, is a number that McGregor himself has referenced, claiming past UFC fights netted him over $30 million each. Now sit those numbers alongside the UFC 329 structure. If the formula is built on an average of McGregor's historical PPV draws, events that generated between 1.5 and 2.4 million buys each, and that average is converted into a streaming era equivalent, then a guaranteed base of $15 million is not a number that surprises anyone who has done the math. It is, in fact, arguably the minimum that any credible formula would produce. The broader picture of where McGregor stands financially in 2026 adds another layer to this story. His net worth has been reported to be around $250 million as of 2026. A significant portion of that came not from fighting but from business, specifically the sale of his proper No. 12 whiskey brand, which generated a reported payout of over $100 million for his stake. Many have blamed McGregor's incredible wealth as the reason for his inactivity and perceived lack of focus. The argument goes, a man who does not need money does not have the same hunger, and hunger in combat sports is not metaphorical. It is the difference between a fighter who walks through discomfort in training because the alternative is destitution, and a fighter who needs to manufacture that urgency from somewhere else entirely. McGregor has insisted sleeping in gyms, running morning sessions with obsessive intensity, that his motivation is undiminished. But the question lingers, and the betting markets reflect it, with odds sitting heavily against him heading into July 11, none of which changes what he earns. The payday is built on history, not on current form. The story of how much Conor McGregor will make for his UFC return does not end with a number. It ends with a question, and that question, one the MMA community has been circling for months, is what happens after UFC 329? The fight versus Holloway is McGregor's first of 2 remaining on his current UFC contract. Therefore, his next move is extremely contingent on how the fight on Saturday, July 11 plays out. 2 fights left, one in July, one to be determined, and then, potentially, the most consequential free agency in combat sports history. As Ariel Helwani framed it, with the streaming world, with Netflix, with Amazon, all these people paying big top dollar for sport. Could you imagine a Conor McGregor fight on the open market? What do you think Netflix would pay for that? They would pay a lot of money. That framing is not hyperbole. Netflix paid over $5 billion for NFL games. Amazon Prime acquired Thursday Night Football for over $1 billion per year. These platforms have demonstrated that they will pay extraordinary sums for sporting events that move the needle on subscriber acquisition. And if there is one combat sports figure whose name can genuinely move the subscriber needle, whose return to an octagon generates the kind of cultural moment that makes non-sports fans tune in, it is McGregor. As far as his future goes, McGregor doesn't seem interested in signing any extensions. During his time away from the sport, he has been open about the possibility of fighting outside of the UFC. He's spoken about a possible move into bare-knuckle boxing. And as a part owner of BKFC, he's already had plenty of involvement in that world. He's also suggested another run at professional boxing, where he previously fought Floyd Mayweather in 2017. Both those options are off limits while he remains under contract with the UFC. That might not be the case for much longer. So here's what the financial picture of McGregor's UFC 329 payday actually represents. When you zoom all the way out, it is not just the number on his check for one night in Las Vegas. It is a statement about his market value heading into the final chapter of his competitive career. The UFC needed to set that number at a level that kept him satisfied, that made him walk into that cage in July without resentment, without the quiet grievance of a man who feels he has been undervalued. Because a resentful McGregor, a McGregor who is going through the motions while calculating how much better the next deal somewhere else might be, is a McGregor who does not deliver the spectacle that justifies the investment. The community reaction to all of this has been split along the lines you might expect. On one side, genuine excitement, a generation of MMA fans who grew up watching McGregor at his peak, who miss the energy he brings to fight week, who want to see the greatest showman in the sport's history back under the brightest lights one more time. On the other side, skepticism about his age, his ring rust, his 5-year absence, and the reality that Max Holloway has spent those 5 years becoming an even more complete fighter than he was when McGregor last competed. The betting odds heading into UFC 329 favor Holloway, with McGregor listed as a significant underdog. The competitive questions are real. The 5-year gap since McGregor's last fight makes this return particularly significant. At 37 years old, he'll face questions about ring rust and recovery from his leg injury. McGregor last competed at UFC 264 in July 2021 when he suffered a gruesome leg fracture in his trilogy fight with Dustin Poirier. In the 5 years since, his only scheduled fight was a bout against Michael Chandler, planned for June 2024, which collapsed when McGregor withdrew with a broken toe just weeks before fight night. 2 pullouts, 1 catastrophic leg break, significant questions about his health, his discipline, and his ability to perform at welterweight, a division 15 pounds heavier than his natural home. These are not small concerns, and the betting market, which tends to cut through the hype more efficiently than any pundit, has priced them in clearly. But here is the verdict on the financial question this video set out to answer. How much will Conor McGregor make for his UFC return? The guaranteed base, built on Dana White's formula, calibrated to McGregor's historical PPV averages across the 5 biggest events in UFC history, is expected to exceed $15 million. Total earnings, when performance bonuses, streaming engagement incentives, and any back-end elements are included, are projected to sit somewhere between $20 million and $30 million, with some estimates suggesting the ceiling could be higher, depending on how UFC 329 performs as a Paramount subscriber acquisition event. McGregor himself put it simply, "I've got a great deal off the UFC. They honored me. Finally." Speaking at UFC 328's post-fight press conference, Dana White confirmed a new compensation structure is in place, and that McGregor's earnings under the new system reflect his historical drawing power. And that is ultimately what this story is. It is not just about one night in Las Vegas in July 2026. It is about a sport reckoning with what it owes its biggest star. It is about a new financial era, streaming replacing pay-per-view, formulas replacing buy rates, and the extraordinary lengths the UFC went to in order to make that transition work for the one fighter who could expose every flaw in it if he chose to walk away. The number on McGregor's check at UFC 329 is not just a payday. It is the price of keeping the most commercially significant figure in MMA history inside the tent for one more chapter. Whether that investment delivers on July 11, whether McGregor walks out of T-Mobile Arena with his hand raised or face down on the canvas, the money will already have been earned. Because the moment that announcement dropped, Paramount got a marketing campaign no advertising budget could have bought. The sport got the oxygen it always runs on when McGregor is involved. And the UFC got the one thing it needed most, heading into its new era. Proof that its biggest stars will still show up. The rest, everything that happens when the cage door closes, is just the fight.